The plastic cup sits in front of me, mocking the years I've spent building this life. Still, I don't flinch. Just adjust the wine in my hand, the crystal cold against my palm. As their laughter rises around the table, the scent of my estate's finest vintage fills the air. While they continue their chatter, oblivious, I realize how far they've drifted, how little respect they have for what I've built. That's when I pour, the wine flowing slow and deliberate. This is my legacy, and I'll make sure they never forget who holds it. All right, before we dive into this crazy story, do me a favor. Subscribe and tell us where you're watching from. Ginny sat at the head of the dinner table, her hands resting gently on the polished wood. The air was warm, heavy with the scent of rosemary and garlic, the kind of comforting aroma that filled her home on evenings like this, the kind of evening she used to love. There was something special about family dinners, something that had become rare over the years, but tonight felt different. The room was lit by soft candlelight, the flickering glow dancing across the faces of her children, her granddaughter, and even Rose, who had made the drive up from town just for this. A fine meal had been carefully prepared, one Ginny had spent the afternoon organizing, a medley of roasted vegetables, succulent lamb, and freshly baked bread. The kind of spread that spoke to years of tradition, to the effort she had always put into bringing the family together, even if they didn't always appreciate it. But it wasn't the meal that made her pause. It wasn't the glistening, crimson wine that poured into the glasses, nor the fine china that had been set with such care. It was the small, disposable plastic cup that was handed to her as soon as she sat down. A sharp, unspoken chill swept through the air. Ginny's fingers tightened slightly around the stem of her own glass, the deep crimson liquid in it gleaming almost mockingly in contrast. For a moment she thought she must have misheard. Had they said, "plastic cup"? But there it was, placed in front of her like an insult wrapped in convenience, a reminder of the way her children had come to view her over the years. Micah was already seated, a glass of wine in hand, laughing with Trina about some triviality that Ginny couldn't quite place. It wasn't that Ginny wasn't used to their dismissiveness. She had spent years in the background, her presence ignored, her wisdom dismissed. But this was different. This was a blatant statement. A plastic cup for the matriarch of the Montgomery estate, the woman who had cultivated the land, nurtured the vineyard, and carried this family through thick and thin. Ginny kept her face perfectly still, her lips pressed together in the kind of calm composure that had taken her decades to perfect. She knew how to keep her thoughts behind a closed door. But beneath her cool exterior, a fire began to burn, not out of anger, but something much more dangerous. Micah and Trina exchanged a glance, the corners of their mouths curling upward in some private amusement. They were unaware, blissfully ignorant of the insult they had just handed her. To them, it was just another dinner, just another chance to mock the past, their inheritance, their legacy, whatever they thought it was. But Ginny saw it for what it was, a silent dismissal of everything she had built. She did not react, of course. Ginny had learned long ago that there was power in silence, in measured stillness. She glanced down at the plastic cup, its flimsy edges a stark contrast to the weight of the crystal glass she had so often used in her past. In a quieter, less obvious moment, she lifted her phone from her bag and snapped a quick photo of the cup, its cheapness almost glaring in the soft glow of the dinner table. She titled it silently in her mind, "Memories," before tucking the device back into her bag. The photo would stay with her, an unspoken reminder of the depths of disrespect. Lila's eyes met hers from across the table. For a brief second, they locked, a moment of understanding that didn't need words. Ginny could see it in her granddaughter's gaze, the quiet recognition of what was happening, the growing awareness of the world Ginny had built around them, and how easily it could all slip through her fingers. The silence between them spoke volumes. Ginny's heart, steady and sure, beat in time with the fire now kindling inside her. This moment, this small, seemingly insignificant gesture, would not go unnoticed. She would not let it go. The evening continued around her, a chorus of clinking glasses and half-hearted conversation. Trina's voice trilled on about something trivial, something meaningless, but Ginny's mind was elsewhere. She was already thinking ahead, the plans taking shape in her mind, the pieces falling into place like a well-constructed vineyard. The world could change, and it would. Ginny was done being invisible. Done being passed over. Done being underestimated. As the meal unfolded, Ginny's eyes never left the plastic cup in front of her. Micah's laughter still filled the air, Trina's forced politeness grating on her ears, but all Ginny could focus on was the quiet photograph in her mind, the one she had just captured. This was just the beginning. The clinking of silverware against porcelain filled the moments of silence that followed, but it wasn't the sounds of dinner that Ginny heard now. It was Trina's voice cutting through the air like a knife. Ginny's eyes never left her plate, her fork hovering over a bite of roasted lamb, but the words came at her, sharp and uninvited. "Maybe it's time to downsize," Trina said, her voice bright with that sweet, too sweet edge that always masked something insidious underneath. "The vineyard's getting too much for you, don't you think? You're not as young as you used to be." Ginny's hand tightened on the fork, her knuckles whitening slightly, but she didn't respond. The lamb in front of her had gone cold. In fact, everything around her seemed to grow quiet, as if the air had thickened and slowed. She could feel the blood rush to her head, her heart beginning to beat a little faster. But still, she stayed silent. Micah, sitting across from her, chuckled. His laugh was hollow, as if rehearsed, and Ginny could hear the condescension under the surface. "Yeah, Mom," he added too eagerly, his voice laced with that casual dismissal that had become all too familiar. "I mean, you've done enough. You deserve a break, right?" Ginny's jaw clenched so tightly she thought it might crack, but she refused to let any of it show. The hurt was familiar. The sting of their words had been a constant for years now, but this was different. This was a reminder, a loud, public reminder, that they didn't see the value of what she had built. They didn't understand the history, the sweat, the tears that had gone into this vineyard. And now, they were openly mocking her legacy. Her eyes flicked briefly to Lila, who sat at the far end of the table, her posture stiff, her face unreadable. The girl had always been so quiet, so observant. Ginny could tell she was aware of the cruelty hiding behind Trina's smile. Lila's eyes darted back and forth between her parents and Ginny, her lips pressed tightly together, trying to make sense of what she was hearing. Ginny felt a pang of something deep inside, a mix of anger and something she couldn't quite place. There was a responsibility now, one that went beyond her. Ginny wasn't just fighting for herself anymore. She was fighting for Lila too. Ginny let the conversation wash over her, though each word felt like another weight on her chest. She could hear the smug satisfaction in Trina's voice, how she seemed so sure that Ginny's time had passed. "There's no shame in letting go, Ginny," Trina continued, as if she were speaking to a child, her voice laced with patronizing sweetness. "You've had a good run. It's just getting too much for one person. A smaller house, less upkeep. You could enjoy life more." She smiled, a gleaming, fake smile. "We'd be happy to help you find something more manageable. Of course." Ginny swallowed the growing lump in her throat. Her gaze flickered over the room, to Micah, who was still grinning like a dog with a bone, and to Trina, whose eyes were glinting with that same sense of control, as if she were already deciding what was best for Ginny's future. She could feel the rage rising in her chest, an all-consuming fire. It was burning low, simmering beneath the surface, waiting for the right moment. But Ginny did not let it show. She kept her head down, her hands still clasped lightly on the table, her lips unmoving. But inside, a different kind of shift was happening. Ginny had always kept her composure, her silence, because she knew it gave her power. But now, as the words swirled around her like dust in the wind, something inside her snapped. This was too much. She was done letting them dictate the terms of her life. The vineyard was hers, not theirs. This wasn't just a meal, not just a casual conversation. This was a declaration. And Ginny wasn't about to let them claim victory. She set her fork down with deliberate calm, the soft sound of metal meeting porcelain breaking the tension in the room. It was a small sound, but it felt monumental to her. She glanced at Lila, whose eyes were wide, waiting for her response. Ginny gave a small, almost imperceptible nod, her way of silently telling her granddaughter that she was aware of the game being played, and aware of the stakes. Ginny shifted her gaze to Trina, whose smile had not wavered. "You know," Ginny said quietly, her voice low but steady. "You're right. It's getting to be a lot for one person, but it's not going anywhere. And neither am I." Micah's smile faltered for a second, his brow furrowing as if he couldn't quite grasp the implication. Trina's eyes narrowed, but Ginny could see the hesitation in her face now. She'd expected compliance, submission, but what she had received was something unexpected: defiance. Lila was watching her now, not with judgment, but with admiration. The shift had begun, and Ginny could feel it in every inch of her. She would not be taken for granted any longer. Her eyes moved back to Trina, who was trying to recover from the unexpected response, but Ginny wasn't done. She wasn't finished with them, not by a long shot. This was only the beginning, and Ginny was finally ready to play the game on her own terms. The vineyard stretched out before Ginny like a living memory, one that had been sown with her own hands, watered with the sweat of her labor, and tended with the kind of care that only comes from a deep, unshakable love for the land. She stood at the window of her study, her eyes tracing the rows of vines that now seemed to grow wild in the setting sun, their tendrils reaching out as if trying to grasp something, anything, to hold on to. It had been years since she had felt that rush of excitement, the thrill of building something from the ground up. The vineyard was her creation. When she and Thomas had first planted those grapes, there had been a kind of magic in the air, an unspoken promise that with hard work, love, and patience, they would leave something enduring, something that would grow even as they aged. And for a time, it did. The vineyard flourished, as did their lives together. Ginny smiled faintly, her fingers tracing the edge of the old photograph on her desk, a sepia-toned picture of the first harvest. Thomas, young and strong, standing beside her with the same determination she had once carried in her heart. Those were the days. They had worked side by side, building the estate from nothing, and she had never once questioned the effort. It had been their dream. They had shared it, and in a way, it had bound them. But that was before the distance had crept between them, before the years of disappointment had worn her down, before the endless promises of "I'll do better" turned into empty words. She could still see Thomas in her mind's eye, standing in the vineyards during their busiest seasons, wiping sweat from his brow with the back of his hand. They had been a team once. Ginny felt a knot tighten in her chest. There was no time to linger on those old feelings, though. Not anymore. The joy of those days had turned into a quiet ache that could no longer be soothed. She blinked, forcing herself to focus on the present, but her mind kept drifting back to the early years, to the long days spent planting and nurturing, when everything had felt possible, when the world had felt like a promise. But as the years passed, that promise had eroded. The vineyard had continued to thrive, but the family, Her family had not. Ginny thought of Micah, now 45, and Trina, her sharp-edged presence always hovering at the edges of every conversation. They were adults now, their own lives fully formed, but in Ginny's eyes, they had never truly grown up. They had taken the estate for granted, like it was something that had always been there, something that would always remain untouched by the passage of time. And somewhere along the way, she had let it happen. Micah had always been the golden boy, or at least, he thought he was. He'd never known how to work the land, how to care for it the way Ginny had. But he had always been the first to claim what was rightfully his. She had spent years trying to instill in him the value of hard work, the importance of dedication. She had tried to teach him respect for the land, for the legacy, for the family. But it was always met with that dismissive smile of his, as if she were speaking a foreign language he didn't care to understand. Trina was worse. She had wrapped herself in layers of politeness and charm, but underneath, Ginny knew, she was a manipulator. She saw the vineyard not as a legacy, but as a business opportunity. Trina had never appreciated the sweat that had gone into making it what it was. She saw only the potential to profit from it, to carve it up, and sell it off when Ginny was no longer able to manage it. Ginny's thoughts began to cloud, anger flaring up from deep within. She had given everything, her time, her energy, her very life, to build this vineyard. And yet, in the eyes of her children, it had always been just another thing to be taken, just another thing to pass off once they were finished with it. She closed her eyes, the pressure of years of resentment and frustration building in her chest. She had sacrificed so much for them, for her family, and yet they had never once understood. It was as if they had assumed the vineyard would always be there, that she would always be there, to pick up the pieces when they faltered. Should she have been firmer? She wondered that often, in the quiet moments when no one was watching. Should she have pushed them harder, demanded more respect, insisted on the value of what she had worked so hard to create? Or had it all been a lost cause from the beginning? The regret was there, a faint but persistent voice in the back of her mind, always whispering. Maybe, if she had been stronger, the vineyard wouldn't be on the verge of slipping from her grasp. Maybe her children would have understood what it meant to care for something, to nurture it until it thrived. Maybe, just maybe, they would have seen her as more than a tool to be used and discarded when they were done. Ginny stood up suddenly, the chair scraping against the floor. She walked to the back of the room, towards the safe tucked beneath the built-in shelves. She knew what she had to do. With a soft click, the safe opened, and Ginny reached for the folder that contained the last will and testament she had carefully written years ago. She had never felt the need to change it before. It had always been her intention to pass the estate along to her children, to Micah, the son she had raised, despite everything. But now everything felt different. She could feel the finality of this decision as her fingers brushed the edge of the paper. The world had changed, and so had she. Ginny sat back down, the weight of the decision pressing heavily on her chest. Her mind raced as she began to draft new terms, new provisions that would protect her legacy, her vineyard, from the hands of those who had never understood it. Lila would be the one to carry it forward, the only one who had shown true respect, true understanding. She couldn't undo the past, but she could change the future. And that future, she decided, would belong to Lila. Ginny sat in the plush leather chair, her hands folded neatly in her lap. The office was familiar but cold, the walls lined with rows of law books that seemed to stare down at her with an impartial, distant judgment. Eric Lawson sat across from her, his gray hair neatly combed, his glasses perched at the end of his nose, as he flipped through the folder she had brought with her. The air was heavy with the scent of aged paper and faint traces of leather, a scent that had always made Ginny feel like she was stepping into something final, something irrevocable. The sunlight filtered through the blinds, casting shadows that stretched long across the floor. It was an hour for decisions, and Ginny was more certain than she'd ever been. "I've been thinking about the will," Ginny began, her voice steady, but with an edge that even she hadn't expected. "It needs to change." Eric set down the papers he had been skimming, folding his hands together, his expression unreadable. "I assume you've already made up your mind, Ginny." Her gaze met his, sharp, unwavering. "I'm disinheriting Micah and Trina. They won't inherit the vineyard. I want Lila to have it." Eric didn't flinch. He had known Ginny for years, understood the quiet strength that pulsed through her veins. Still, there was something about her resolve now, a kind of steel that had hardened into something unbreakable. "You're sure?" he asked, his tone measured, professional. "This is a big step. Once the changes are made, there's no going back." Ginny nodded slowly, her mind already far ahead of him. She could feel the taste of betrayal lingering in her mouth, sharp and acrid. Micah and Trina had already shown her what they were capable of, and now she was showing them. She would not let them tarnish everything she had built. The vineyard was more than just land and wine. It was her legacy. "They've shown me who they really are," she said, her voice low, almost cold. "They've made their intentions clear. I won't let them take what I've worked for, what I've sacrificed for all these years. They don't respect it. They don't respect me." Eric leaned back in his chair, his hands steepled in front of him. "You're right. I've seen the way they've treated you. But I think we should add a no-contest clause to the will. That way, if Micah and Trina decide to challenge it, which they likely will, they'll forfeit whatever portion they might have inherited. It's the only way to make sure your wishes are honored without interference." Ginny took a deep breath, considering his words. She had spent a lifetime protecting what was hers, and now she would protect it with the full force of the law. "I agree," she said, her voice firmer now. "They'll challenge it. They always think they're entitled to everything. A no-contest clause will make sure they don't get a thing." Eric nodded, making notes on the papers in front of him. Ginny felt a strange sense of relief wash over her. This was it. There was no turning back now. She would no longer be the matriarch they dismissed and disrespected. She was reclaiming her power, taking back control of everything that had been taken from her over the years. Her hand, which had been resting on her lap, shifted to the folder in front of her. She didn't look at it, but she knew what it contained. The will she had painstakingly crafted over the years was no longer the will she wanted. That woman, the woman who had hoped to pass on the estate to her children, to Micah, who had been her pride, was gone. The new will, the one that would secure her legacy, would name Lila as the primary beneficiary. Lila was the only one who understood what this vineyard meant, the only one who had ever shown true respect for it. For Ginny herself. The only one who truly saw the value in what she had built. Ginny had always known that the vineyard would outlive her, but now she knew with certainty that it would live on in the right hands. Lila's hands. Ginny pushed the thoughts of Micah and Trina out of her mind, focusing instead on the quiet power she now felt. The years of feeling unseen, undervalued, and dismissed were over. This was her moment. Eric looked up, catching her eyes. "You're sure about this?" "Yes," Ginny replied, the weight of the decision settling into her chest like a final exhale. "I've never been more sure." The silence between them stretched, but it wasn't uncomfortable. It was a pause before the storm, a pause before she signed away the past. Ginny knew this was the end of one chapter and the beginning of another, and for the first time in years, it felt like a chapter she was writing with her own hand. Without another word, Ginny reached for the pen. The cool metal felt like a weapon in her hand as she signed her name on the line, the ink permanent, a mark of finality. She passed the documents over to Eric, her fingers brushing his as he took them. Eric set the papers aside with a quiet sigh, his fingers grazing the pages. "It's done," he said. Ginny stood slowly, her movements deliberate, as if savoring the moment. She was no longer just a woman in a house full of memories. She was a woman in control of her future. The feeling was unfamiliar, but it tasted sweet. As Ginny turned to leave the office, the door clicking behind her, she felt lighter, freer. She was done living in the shadows of her past, done with the regrets and the sacrifices that had gone unrecognized. The vineyard was hers, and soon it would belong to Lila. And that was all that mattered. As the door closed with a soft thud behind her, Ginny's thoughts flickered briefly to Micah and Trina. She didn't need to look back. The future was hers to shape now. And it would be shaped on her terms. The evening felt different from the moment Ginny stepped into the kitchen. The familiar warmth of the old stove, the rustic scent of herbs, and the rhythmic hum of the refrigerator were all there. But tonight, there was a subtle shift in the air. Tonight, she wasn't just preparing another family dinner, she was preparing a statement. The kitchen was filled with the faint aroma of roasted chicken and garlic, the sounds of a meal being carefully plated. The table was set, and the candles flickered gently in the dim light, casting long shadows across the wooden surface. It all looked like any other dinner, but Ginny's mind was on the details, the things that would make tonight's meal different from every other one she had ever hosted. Her fingers lingered on the label of the bottle of wine sitting on the counter. It was one of her finest vintages, a bottle that had been aged carefully over the years, waiting for the perfect moment. Most people would never even see a bottle like this, let alone taste it. But tonight, she was going to change everything. This wasn't just wine. This was a declaration. Ginny had always kept a few bottles of her best wines tucked away, hidden in the cellar. They were precious to her, a symbol of everything she had worked for. Micah and Trina, however, had come to expect something far less remarkable. In the past, Ginny had often settled for supermarket wines, something cheap and easy, not because it was what she wanted, but because it kept the peace. Not tonight. The cork popped with a satisfying sound, and the deep ruby liquid swirled into the crystal decanter. Ginny let the aroma fill the room, savoring it for a moment, before she poured the wine into the crystal glasses. The deep color gleamed in the glass, catching the light and casting a rich, almost regal glow across the table. When she carried the glasses to the dining room, the first thing she noticed was the way the room seemed to change the moment she walked in. Micah and Trina were already seated, their faces frozen in polite smiles, the tension in the air palpable. Lila was already at the table, her posture straight but relaxed, her eyes bright with curiosity. Rose was there too, her presence steadying, always loyal. Ginny moved gracefully to the head of the table, placing the wine glasses in front of each person. When she got to Trina, she noticed the way her daughter-in-law's eyes narrowed just a fraction as Ginny set the glass down in front of her. The bottle, still in Ginny's hand, felt heavier now, its significance not lost on anyone in the room. She uncorked it with a deliberate slowness, her fingers brushing against the smooth surface of the bottle. The simple act seemed to capture everyone's attention. Micah's eyes flicked toward the bottle with a small, uncertain quirk of his brow, while Trina's lips parted slightly in surprise. "Isn't this a bit much?" Trina asked, her voice dripping with false sweetness. "I mean, don't you usually just grab something from the supermarket?" Ginny didn't flinch. She met Trina's eyes with a calmness that bordered on serene, the weight of the moment settling heavily on her. "Not tonight," she said, her voice quiet but firm. "Tonight calls for something better." The words hung in the air, and for a second, Ginny allowed herself to enjoy the discomfited silence that followed. The tension thickened, and as the wine poured into their glasses, the sound of the liquid filling the crystal seemed almost too loud. Micah shifted in his seat, his fingers twitching, unsure of what to make of the situation. Trina, ever the tactician, tried to recover quickly. She smirked, her voice laced with a sharpness that Ginny had learned to tune out long ago. "Well, I suppose it's nice to see you've finally come around to better taste," Trina said, raising her glass with a forced, almost mocking gesture. Ginny took her seat, savoring the moment as she lifted her own glass to her lips. The wine was smooth, full-bodied, its deep flavor a reminder of everything she had cultivated over the years, and of everything that was now hers to protect. "I've always had good taste," Ginny replied evenly, her eyes never leaving Trina's. "Just never had the right company to share it with." The room seemed to hold its breath for a moment. The air was thick with unspoken words, the sharp edge of Trina's comment still lingering. But Ginny remained unfazed. She was done letting them dictate the tone, the pace, the rules of this family. The wine flowed, the evening continued, but the dynamic had shifted. Ginny could see it in their eyes, the subtle shift in Micah's posture, the way Trina's smile faltered for just a moment before it returned, more tightly controlled. Lila, who had been quietly observing, glanced up at Ginny and smiled. A small, knowing smile that Ginny returned in kind. There was no need for words. The message was clear. Ginny had taken back control. And this small but meaningful act, was just the beginning. As the evening wore on, Ginny allowed herself to enjoy the discomfort that rippled beneath the surface. The wine flowed freely, the tension thick enough to cut with a knife. But Ginny was calm, at peace. She could feel the change, the shift in the power dynamics. They were unsettled, and it felt good. She took a long sip of the wine, letting its rich flavor wash over her senses. This was just the first step, and it was only a matter of time before they realized it. The dinner table, once filled with polite conversation and forced smiles, now simmered with a palpable tension. Ginny took a slow sip of wine, savoring the complex flavors, allowing the moment to stretch. Her gaze moved slowly over the table, the flickering candlelight casting shadows on the faces of her family. They were all there, each in their place, but they were no longer the same. The dynamic had shifted. Trina's smile was tight, her lips drawn in a controlled line, though Ginny could see the subtle tightening around her eyes, the faint flicker of surprise, and perhaps something deeper. Micah was quieter than usual, his posture stiff as he tried to adjust to the change in the air, no longer the complacent son who had expected to inherit everything without question. Lila, sitting across from Ginny, seemed almost too aware of it all. Her eyes flicked between Ginny and the others, a silent understanding passing between them. The girl was learning the subtle dance of power that Ginny had long mastered. There was no need for words. The shift was unmistakable. Ginny's fingers brushed against the edge of her phone, which lay discreetly on the table beside her glass of wine. She hadn't used it throughout the meal, allowing the evening to unfold in its own time, but now she slid it towards her. She glanced once more at the scene before her. The table full of fine china, the elegant decanter now half empty, and Trina's frozen expression as she took another sip of the wine. It was perfect. With deliberate calm, Ginny turned on her phone, opened her camera, and adjusted the angle. She took a quiet photo focusing on Trina's face, the shock just barely concealed behind that carefully crafted smile. Her eyes were wide, her lips pressed into an increasingly strained curve. It was the look of someone who thought they were in control, only to realize they were not. Not anymore. Ginny's finger hovered over the screen, reviewing the photo for just a moment before she sent it. She could already imagine the title in her mind, for the future. The words felt like a weight settling into the pit of her stomach, heavy with purpose. This photo wasn't just an image, it was evidence. It was proof of the moment when the rules began to change. The moment when Ginny Montgomery stopped being passive and started taking control of her destiny. Later, when the evening had wound down, Ginny would send the image to Eric. She didn't need to say anything. The picture would speak for itself. It was a reminder for her, too. A reminder that everything, every word and gesture, mattered now. She would never let the world forget how they had tried to dismiss her, how they had underestimated her strength. And when the time came, when Micah and Trina inevitably tried to fight her decisions, she would have this moment, this evidence. Lila had noticed the click of the camera, though Ginny wasn't sure if she'd caught the full weight of the significance. Ginny felt her granddaughter's gaze again, this time softer, with an understanding that went beyond words. There was a quiet approval in the way Lila watched her, and it warmed Ginny's chest. Lila would never make the same mistakes that Micah had. She was smart, sharp, and, most importantly, she understood the value of legacy. As the evening continued, Ginny let the conversation around the table drift, allowing the weight of the moment to settle in. Micah and Trina tried to return to their usual banter, but it wasn't the same. Ginny could feel the change, the crack in the facade. They were unsettled, and that was exactly what she wanted. When the night finally wound down, Ginny made her way to her study, the photo still fresh in her mind. She sat down at her desk and opened her laptop, pulling up her email. She attached the photo to a new message, typing a simple note to Eric. "This is for when the time comes. Keep it safe." Ginny paused before hitting send, her fingers resting lightly on the keyboard. This wasn't about petty revenge. She wasn't trying to hurt anyone. But the reality was that she needed to protect what was hers, to ensure that Micah and Trina would never get the chance to manipulate her or her legacy again. This photo, this simple act of capturing the moment, was part of a larger plan. It was part of ensuring that when her time came, the vineyard, the estate, the legacy she had worked for would be left in the right hands. Lila's hands. Ginny leaned back in her chair, the weight of the decision settling into her bones. This was calculated, deliberate, and it was just the beginning. As she hit send, Ginny allowed herself a moment of quiet satisfaction. She was in control now. The pieces were moving, and soon everyone would realize just how powerful she really was. The door to her study was still open, and she could hear Lila's quiet steps approaching. The girl appeared in the doorway, her expression calm, but her eyes filled with something unspoken. "I sent it," Ginny said simply, not needing to explain. Lila nodded, her lips curling into a small smile. The same smile Ginny had seen earlier at the table. The future was in motion, and Ginny knew it would be exactly what she made of it. Nothing and no one would stand in her way. The afternoon sun filtered softly through the curtains, casting a warm glow over the living room where Ginny sat, her fingers resting lightly on the armrest of her chair. The house was quiet, the kind of silence that only came when things were about to shift. She had long ago learned to trust the stillness, to understand that in the silence lay the moments when the world truly changed. Micah and Trina had arrived earlier, their polished smiles belying the tension that simmered just beneath the surface. They had no idea Ginny could feel it. The quiet calculation in their voices, the way their glances kept darting toward each other. Ginny had known this conversation was coming. She had known it ever since she had taken back control, ever since she had made the changes to the will. This was their last-ditch effort, the moment when they would try to convince her to give up what was rightfully hers. She sat across from them now, the room heavy with the weight of the unspoken. Trina's polished tone broke the silence first, smooth and sweet, like honey, but with a sharpness that Ginny didn't miss. Ginny, we've been thinking, Trina began, her smile wide and almost too warm. Maybe it's time for you to consider selling the vineyard. I mean, you've worked so hard and we both know it's becoming too much for you to handle on your own. Ginny's fingers curled tighter around the armrest, but she kept her face impassive. She knew exactly where this was going. The offer to sell the vineyard, the thinly veiled suggestion that it was simply too much for her to manage, it was all part of their plan, their attempt to weaken her resolve. They wanted her to let go. They wanted her to step aside and let them take control. Micah, ever the eager accomplice, nodded along. "It makes sense, Mom," he said, his voice slow and measured as if he were talking to a child. "You could move somewhere smaller, less demanding. A change of pace, you know? We'd be happy to help you find a place." Ginny didn't respond right away, letting the silence hang in the air between them like a tightrope. She could feel the weight of their expectations, the pressure to give in, but she wasn't about to back down now. The vineyard was hers, and it always would be. "I'm not going anywhere," Ginny said finally, her voice calm but firm. "I'm not selling the vineyard, and I'm certainly not moving into a smaller place. This is my home, my life's work. I'm still capable of managing it." She held Micah's eyes for a moment before turning to Trina, who was watching her with a slightly narrowed gaze. There was a hint of something behind her smile now, something like annoyance, though she quickly masked it with a thin layer of politeness. "We're just concerned, Ginny," Trina said, her tone slipping back into that honeyed sweetness. "You've been having trouble keeping up with everything lately. It might be time to think about the future, you know? To downsize and let us help manage things. It's what's best, really." Ginny's expression didn't change. The years of disrespect, the subtle manipulation, the casual dismissal of everything she had built. It all rose in her chest, fueling a quiet fire. This wasn't about concern. This wasn't about helping. This was about control. "I don't need your help, Trina," Ginny said, her voice unshakable. "I'm perfectly capable of managing my affairs. I've done it for years and I'll continue to do it. If you can't respect that, then perhaps it's time for you to stop pretending that you have any say in the matter." Lila, who had been sitting quietly in the corner, her eyes flicking between the three of them, stood up at that moment. Her presence was like a quiet storm, calm but undeniably powerful. She said nothing, but Ginny could see the subtle approval in her granddaughter's gaze, the way she nodded ever so slightly, as if to say, "You're doing the right thing." Trina's smile tightened, the veneer of politeness beginning to crack. "Well, Ginny," she said, her voice just a touch more strained now. "If you insist on keeping things the way they are, I suppose there's not much more we can do. But it's a lot of work for one person. You've got to think about your health, your future." Ginny felt her pulse quicken, but she kept her expression steady. "I've thought about it," she replied simply, "and I've made my decision." Micah shifted uncomfortably in his seat, clearly caught between his mother's sharp prodding and the unspoken reality that he couldn't push his mother any further. But Trina wasn't done yet. She leaned in, her tone dropping just a fraction as she pushed harder. "Ginny, think about it," she said softly. "This estate is far too big for you to manage alone. If you were to let us handle things, you wouldn't have to worry about anything. You could relax, enjoy your time, and we'd take care of the vineyard. It's what's best for everyone." But Ginny stood firm. "I'm not interested in your help, Trina," she said again, her voice icy now. "This is my legacy, and I'll decide what happens to it, not you." Trina's smile faltered, and the mask of politeness slipped entirely, revealing something darker behind her eyes. She was done pretending. But Ginny wasn't intimidated. She wasn't the woman she once was. The one who had let her children trample over her, who had bent to their will. The power had shifted, and it was no longer in their hands. "I'm done here," Ginny said, her voice sharp and final. "Don't come to me again with offers I've already rejected." Ginny turned her back on them, her steps purposeful as she moved to the door. She could hear Trina's murmured protests and Micah's awkward shifting, but it didn't matter. They knew now that she would not be manipulated. Not again. When Ginny reached her study, she sat down at her desk and opened a new email to Eric. She detailed the conversation with her children, careful to include every word, every attempt to undermine her control. She attached the photo she had taken earlier, the one that would serve as a reminder for later, and hit send, with a quiet satisfaction. The fight had only just begun, but Ginny was ready. The room was still, save for the faint rustling of paper as Ginny sat at her desk, the lamp casting a soft golden glow over the page before her. Her hands were steady, the tip of the pen hovering just above the clean sheet of paper. She had written many things in her life, contracts, letters, notes to her children, but this would be the most important, the final act of her control. Ginny had spent years carefully constructing this moment, the culmination of decades of quiet frustration and the pain of watching her family erode the very legacy she had built. She had tried to guide them, tried to teach them respect, but it had all been met with indifference or worse, manipulation. She had worked tirelessly for this vineyard, for this estate, and they had come to see it as nothing more than a commodity, something to be sold, something to be handed over when it was no longer convenient. Her fingers gripped the pen tighter, her mind racing with the words she knew she needed to say. She had always been a woman of action, of quiet strength, but now she would put those words down on paper. "To whomever reads this letter," Ginny began, her voice echoing in her mind as she wrote, "I have spent a lifetime building what I leave behind, and it is with a heavy heart that I write these words. I have watched as my son Micah and his wife Trina have come to view the vineyard not as a legacy, but as something to be sold when it no longer serves their needs. For years I have given them my trust, only to watch it squandered. They have made their intentions clear. They would strip away the land, tear apart what I've fought so hard to preserve, for their own gain. Though they are my children, I can no longer ignore the years of disrespect and manipulation that have eroded any hope I had of them understanding the value of this estate, of the sacrifice it took to build it. For this reason, I have made the difficult decision to disinherit them." Ginny paused, her heart heavy with the weight of the words she had written. Disinheriting her children was no easy decision, but it was the right one. Micah and Trina had never understood the sacrifices she had made for them, and now they sought to control the vineyard as if it were a mere possession. It was time for Ginny to take the reins, to ensure that the legacy she had created would not fall into their hands. She picked up the pen again, her resolve hardening with every word she wrote. "I leave everything to Lila. She is the only one who has truly understood the heart of this vineyard, the only one who has shown me the respect I deserve, and who has the strength to carry this legacy forward. It is my hope that Lila will protect this estate with the same care and devotion that I have given it. The vineyard is not just a piece of land, it is a living testament to everything I have worked for. To ensure its future, Lila will be entrusted with the full responsibility of its management. There are provisions in place to ensure the estate remains intact, and no one, not even my children, will be able to challenge her authority over it." Ginny paused, her hand resting on the paper as she reflected on her decision. Lila was young, but she was sharp, capable, and, most importantly, she understood what this vineyard meant. Ginny trusted her, and that was why she was the only one worthy of inheriting everything Ginny had built. As she signed the letter, Ginny felt a deep sense of finality wash over her. This was it. There would be no turning back now. The decision had been made, the future secured. The vineyard would remain in the family, but only in the right hands. Ginny sealed the letter carefully, folding it and slipping it into a folder that she tucked away in her desk drawer. She didn't need to read it again. She knew it was right. She had spent so many years worrying about her children, trying to teach them the lessons they never learned. But now, it was time to stop worrying. The future of the vineyard was in Lila's hands. Ginny stood up and walked to the safe in the corner of the room. The heavy metal door clicked open with a satisfying sound, and she placed the letter inside. She knew it would be essential when the time came. No one would be able to challenge her decisions. Not now, not ever. She closed the safe and stood there for a moment, her eyes scanning the room. The weight of everything she had done, everything she had worked for, seemed to settle on her shoulders like a cloak. But there was no fear in her heart, no regret, only peace. With one final glance around the room, Ginny left the study and made her way down the hallway to the front door. She could hear Lila moving in the kitchen, her soft humming echoing through the house. Ginny smiled, knowing that her granddaughter was the future, the one who would ensure the vineyard would continue to grow long after Ginny was gone. Ginny's steps were steady as she made her way back to the kitchen, her heart full. The letter was done, the future secured. And for the first time in years, Ginny felt like she could finally breathe. Her legacy was safe. Ginny sat at the kitchen table, her fingers gliding over the papers before her with a quiet, deliberate calm. The morning sunlight streamed through the window, casting a warm glow across the wood. But inside, she was cool, focused, and unyielding. She had always been one to act with precision, to move with purpose. Today, that purpose was clearer than ever. Her hand rested on the legal documents as she looked at the names printed across the top. Micah, Rose, Lila. These were the names that would shape her future. Names that held power, but only if she chose to give it. The power had always been hers to take back. And now, she would. The decision to revoke the powers of attorney she had given Micah was not an easy one. For years, she had trusted him with her affairs, assuming that he would honor her wishes, that he would care for her with the respect she had always shown him. But that was before she had seen him for who he truly was, a man more interested in control than in love. That trust had long since dissolved, eroded by years of neglect and manipulation. Ginny's fingers tightened around the pen as she drew a firm line across the document, crossing out Micah's name. It wasn't just about protecting the vineyard anymore. It was about taking back what she had always held, the ability to make her own decisions, to choose the people who would safeguard her legacy. She replaced his name with Rose's, the woman who had stood by her through everything. Rose had been more than just a loyal advisor. She had been a true friend, someone who understood Ginny's heart and the importance of the vineyard, of family. Ginny had never doubted Rose's integrity, never questioned her loyalty. It was time to make that loyalty official. Ginny signed the document with a steady hand, her resolve unshaken. She then moved on to the next page, her healthcare proxy. This was another piece of the puzzle, a step toward ensuring that her final days, whenever they came, would be on her terms. She looked at the names printed there, Rose and Lila. Again, she smiled. These were the two people she trusted most in the world, the ones who had never failed her, who had never seen the vineyard as a means to an end. No one else would have a say in her care. She had lived her life on her own terms, and that would not change now. The paperwork was complete. The documents were signed, sealed, and ready for safekeeping. Ginny felt a sense of relief wash over her, the kind of peace that only comes when everything is in its rightful place. But she wasn't done yet. Later that afternoon, Micah called, his voice thick with the same false sweetness he always used when he was trying to push his way into something. "Mom, I've been thinking. I'd like to schedule a visit with your doctor. It's important that I stay up to date on your health, don't you think?" Ginny's eyes narrowed slightly as she held the phone to her ear. She could hear the underlying implication in his voice, the subtle suggestion that she needed someone to look after her, that she couldn't be trusted to make her own decisions. "You're not coming," Ginny said simply, her voice cool but firm. "I don't need your help, Micah, and I don't need you interfering with my health. I have everything under control." There was a pause on the other end, a moment of stunned silence before Micah's voice returned, laced with frustration. "But Mom—" "I said no, Micah," she interrupted, her voice unwavering, "and that's final." She hung up the phone without another word, a quiet satisfaction settling in her chest. This was another boundary they had tried to cross, another way they had tried to claim control over her. But Ginny had drawn the line, and it would not be moved. She forwarded the call record to Eric, attaching a note. "This is my final decision. There will be no further discussions." It was a small act, but it was one that made her future, her decisions, crystal clear. No one could argue her intentions now, not Micah, not Trina, and certainly not anyone else. Rose called later that evening, her voice warm and understanding as always. "Ginny, I just wanted to say how proud I am of you. Taking charge, doing what's right. You've made your legacy clear, and no one can take that away from you now." Ginny smiled as she sat back in her chair, looking out the window toward the vineyard. The sky was turning a deep orange, the last rays of sunlight casting a golden hue across the land. It was peaceful, almost surreal. The vineyard was still hers. Her future was still hers. "I'm not finished yet, Rose," Ginny said quietly, the weight of her words settling into the space between them. "But I've taken control. This is just the beginning." Ginny didn't need to explain. Rose understood. Lila understood too. Ginny had set the wheels in motion, and the path was now clear. Her legacy was secure, her decisions irrevocable. As Ginny stood up, she walked toward the door, her heart steady and sure. There would be no more interference, no more manipulation. The vineyard, her home, her legacy, it would remain safe in the hands of those she trusted. And the rest, as far as Ginny was concerned, could stay outside. The morning was crisp, a light frost still clinging to the edges of the vineyard, but Ginny was already deep in her thoughts. Her kitchen was quiet, save for the occasional click of the coffee pot and the soft hum of the wind outside. The house, now hers in every sense of the word, felt more like a fortress than a home. It was safe, secure. It was exactly how she needed it to be. But today, there was one more thing she had to do. One final act to seal the gap between the family she'd given everything to and the future she was now determined to protect. Ginny had made the arrangements quietly, without fanfare. It was an anonymous donation, a large one, funneled through a charitable organization that Trina despised. She had known for years about the causes that rubbed Trina the wrong way. Causes that stood against everything Trina stood for. Ginny hadn't needed to think long about the recipient. It would be perfect. The sting would be undeniable, a gift, wrapped in irony, delivered with precision. Her fingers moved over the papers one last time as she signed off on the donation, arranging everything without anyone else's knowledge. The funds would be transferred discreetly, and Trina would never know the full weight of the gesture until it was too late. Ginny's lips twitched into a small, almost imperceptible smile. The decision had come easily, and yet there was a quiet satisfaction that settled in her chest, a sense of closure that nothing else could provide. It wasn't about money. It wasn't about punishment. It was about giving Trina a reminder that Ginny was not to be underestimated, that even when her children thought they had won, there would always be a reckoning. Later that morning, when the time was right, Ginny watched the transaction go through. It was final. She had done it. A flicker of emotion passed through her. Not malice, not revenge, but something far more satisfying: control. It wasn't that Trina would lose something tangible. No, it was the knowing, the realization that her own name had been attached to something that meant so little to her and so much to Ginny. That was the real sting. Ginny didn't have to wait long for Trina's reaction. By the afternoon, the phone call came. The voice on the other end was unmistakable, laced with confusion, anger, and a sharp edge of resentment. Ginny could hear it all without even needing to pick up the receiver. Trina was in full defensive mode. "Why?" Trina demanded, her voice strained. "Why would you do this?" "I don't support that charity, you know that. You know how I feel about it. This isn't just a donation, it's a statement, and I won't stand for it." Ginny set the phone down after a moment of silence, watching the room around her as Trina's voice continued, louder now, but distant. There was no need for a response. Ginny wasn't angry. She wasn't even remotely bothered. She knew exactly what this gesture meant. She knew how much it would cut. It wasn't about the money, it was about control, about making a point without saying a word. Ginny had spent too many years allowing her family to push her into corners, allowing them to take what wasn't theirs. But this was her defiance. This was her message. Lila appeared in the doorway, her quiet presence filling the space with a calm that Ginny welcomed. The girl was a steady hand, an anchor in the storm that had been Ginny's life for so long. Lila said nothing at first, just watched Ginny, her eyes full of understanding. Ginny gave a small, knowing smile. "It's done," Ginny said softly, the words weighted with a quiet pride. Lila nodded, a small, silent approval crossing her face. She didn't need to speak. She knew this was not about petty retaliation. It wasn't about hurting Trina for the sake of it. It was about securing the future, about making sure that those who had disrespected her, who had manipulated her for too long, knew that their time had passed. Ginny turned away from the phone, the sound of Trina's voice still ringing in the background, growing fainter as Ginny shut the door on that chapter of her life. It would be the last time Trina ever attempted to control her, the last time anyone would be able to dictate Ginny's decisions. Lila, always perceptive, understood the magnitude of the action. She stepped closer, placing a hand gently on Ginny's shoulder. The gesture was small, but in it, Ginny felt an unspoken promise that the legacy she had fought so hard to preserve would be in good hands. Ginny glanced out the window at the vineyard stretching before her, the rows of vines still bare in the early winter chill, but alive with potential. Everything she had built, everything she had worked for, was safe. And for the first time in a long time, Ginny allowed herself to enjoy the quiet satisfaction of her choices. The road to this moment had been long and fraught with difficulties, but now it was all worth it. The vineyard, the legacy, her future, all would remain untouched by the hands that had tried to claim them. Ginny stood, taking a deep breath. This was just the beginning. The next chapter was already unfolding, and no one, not even her own blood, would stand in her way. The day was cool, with a crispness that cut through the warmth of the house, but Ginny felt no chill. She had already faced too many storms to worry about the cold now. The soft hum of the clock in the hallway marked the passing minutes, a rhythmic reminder of the time she had reclaimed. Her steps were steady as she moved through the house, each room now carrying the weight of her decisions. She was in control. And today, she was going to make it official. The appointment for the cognitive evaluation had been set weeks ago, a routine procedure she had insisted on to quiet any whispers that might arise about her mental state. It was a final step in securing her legacy, a necessary formality to make sure no one would be able to challenge her ability to make independent decisions. The world may have seen her as fragile, a widow, a mother with a strained relationship to her children, But Ginny knew her own mind better than anyone, and it was sharp. The clinic was understated, its sterile walls and buzzing fluorescent lights a stark contrast to the warmth of her estate. But it didn't matter. Ginny walked in with purpose, her posture tall and unwavering. The receptionist greeted her with a forced politeness that was all too familiar, but Ginny paid it no mind. She was here to take care of business, nothing more. The evaluation itself was thorough, a series of questions, exercises, and assessments designed to test everything from memory to decision-making. Ginny had done her research, prepared herself for the ordeal, though she didn't expect it to be anything more than a formality. The questions were easy, and she answered them all without hesitation. The psychologist who administered the test, a quiet, unassuming man named Dr. Carter, watched her with a professional air, though Ginny knew he saw nothing unusual, nothing that would raise concern. When the results came back later that afternoon, Ginny's pulse remained steady. She hadn't expected anything less than a clean bill of health, but seeing the words in black and white gave her an extra sense of assurance. The report confirmed what she already knew. Her mental faculties were intact. Her decision-making ability was unimpaired. The patient exhibits full mental capacity and is able to make decisions independently without any cognitive decline. She smiled, a small but satisfied curl of her lips. The test had been necessary, but now it was over. She was more than capable of maintaining control over her life, her estate, and her future. Ginny quickly forwarded the results to Eric, attaching a note. For future reference, this will help safeguard any future attempts to challenge my decisions. The email felt like a final step in closing the door on anyone who might question her authority. Especially Micah, who had already shown a penchant for manipulation, and Trina, whose attempts to undermine her had grown ever more obvious. As the hours passed, Ginny found herself reflecting on the moment she had been building toward for so long. It was more than just a test of her mental state. It was about her strength, her independence. She had spent too many years putting the needs of others ahead of her own, living in the shadows of expectations. No longer. Later that evening, Rose stopped by for tea, as she often did. She knew how much Ginny valued the rituals they shared, and she also understood the significance of today's events. When Ginny told her about the evaluation and the results, Rose's smile was one of quiet pride, the same kind of pride Ginny had carried in her heart for decades, now reflected back at her. "You've done it, Ginny," Rose said, pouring them both another cup of tea. "Now no one can take this from you. Not your son, not anyone." Ginny looked across the table at Rose, her eyes meeting the older woman's with a sense of finality that only comes after years of struggle. "It's done," she said simply, savoring the moment. "Everything is in place." Lila had been listening from the doorway, her presence always calm and perceptive, and now she stepped forward, her young face full of understanding. She said nothing, but her gaze was steady, full of quiet admiration for her grandmother's strength. Ginny had always known Lila would be the one to carry the torch. The way the girl had never faltered, never wavered in her respect for the land, for Ginny's legacy. It made her certain that the future of the vineyard was in the right hands. There was no more worrying, no more wondering. The moment had come. Ginny was no longer fighting for the vineyard. She was protecting it. Her work was done. "Grandmother," Lila said softly, her voice almost a whisper, "you've really done it." Ginny's lips parted in a smile, and she gave a slight nod. "I have, sweetheart," she replied, "and now it's yours. When the time comes, you'll carry it forward." Ginny felt a wave of peace wash over her, and for the first time in many years there was no fear in her heart, no uncertainty. Her future, their future, was secure. She would never again be underestimated. The decisions had been made, the path laid out, and no one, Not even her son could ever undo what she had built. As the evening wore on and the shadows lengthened across the vineyard, Ginny sat back in her chair, letting the warmth of the tea soothe her bones. The weight of the past had lifted, and the future, as it always had, stretched out before her, boundless, hers to command. And Ginny Montgomery, for the first time in her life, felt the full weight of her own power. The battle was over. But the war, as Ginny knew all too well, was far from won. The phone rang just as Ginny was finishing her tea. She sat back in her chair, her fingers resting lightly on the delicate china as the ring cut through the quiet evening air. It was a call she'd been expecting. A call that had been inevitable since she'd made the changes to her will. Micah. She picked up the receiver, her hand steady, her expression unchanged. "Ginny," came his voice, smooth, familiar, laced with the same false sweetness that had become his signature. "I think it's time we had a talk, a family meeting, you know, to discuss your future care. It's important, don't you think?" Ginny's eyes narrowed slightly, her grip on the receiver tightening just enough to feel the weight of the moment. The request was too clean, too well practiced. This wasn't about her care. This wasn't about family. This was another attempt to make her bend, to maneuver her into a position where she'd feel obligated to hand over control, and Ginny wasn't having it. "I don't think so, Micah," she said, her voice calm but firm, an edge of finality cutting through the words. "I'm not interested in a family meeting. You don't need to discuss my care. I'm perfectly capable of making my own decisions, as I've always been." On the other end, there was a brief silence. Ginny could almost hear the wheels turning in his head, the surprise, then the attempt to regain control. "But Mom, it's important that we all come together. You've got to think about your health, your future. Don't you think it's time to have a proper conversation about what happens next?" Ginny's gaze drifted to the window, where the vineyard stretched out before her, its bare vines standing stark against the fading light of the day. The same vines she had worked tirelessly to cultivate, protect, and grow. The legacy that had never truly been theirs, but had always been hers. Her shoulders relaxed, the weight of years of manipulation melting away. "You've made your concerns clear, Micah," Ginny said evenly, setting the phone down on the table, her resolve unwavering. "But I am not open to being pressured. Not now, not ever. I've made my decisions and they're final. This estate, my care, it's all under my control. You can't have it. You can't control it." She paused, letting the silence linger, the weight of her words sinking in. She wasn't angry. She wasn't upset. She simply was done. Micah and Trina had manipulated her for years, pretending concern when what they really wanted was power. They'd never respected her. And she was done letting them try. Ginny hung up the phone, her movements deliberate. The quiet satisfaction of having turned them down, of having finally taken control, settled over her like a blanket. Lila, who had been watching from the doorway, stepped into the room silently, her expression quiet but full of understanding. Ginny smiled at her granddaughter, who had been by her side through every decision, every quiet step toward reclaiming her life. Lila didn't need to speak. She knew exactly what this meant. "I won't let them control me anymore," Ginny said softly, her gaze steady. "I've spent too many years letting them push me into corners, making me feel small, but no more. This is my life, and I will live it on my terms." Lila nodded, her eyes warm and full of admiration. Ginny knew her granddaughter understood. Lila had never once questioned her decisions or her strength, and Ginny had no doubt that the vineyard, her legacy, would be safe in Lila's hands. The phone had barely finished ringing, but it had been enough. Ginny didn't need to hear the rehearsed apologies or the false concern. She had made her choice. No one would ever make decisions for her again. The power that had once slipped through her fingers was now firmly in her grasp. As the evening continued, Ginny couldn't help but reflect on how far she'd come. The years of doubt, the years of being underestimated by those closest to her, it had all led to this: a moment of peace, a moment of certainty. Ginny's future was hers now, and it would remain hers for as long as she lived. She felt a sense of calm settle over her, and with that calm came a new understanding. The vineyard, the legacy, her care. It was all part of the same thing. A thing she controlled. A thing no one could take from her. Later that night, Ginny sat by the fire, the shadows dancing on the walls, the embers crackling softly. She wasn't just protecting the vineyard. She was protecting herself. The woman who had worked for everything she had, who had never let anyone tell her she couldn't. And for the first time in years, Ginny Montgomery felt truly free. But as she sat there, the weight of her decisions settling comfortably in her chest, she knew this wasn't the end. There would be more battles, more tests, more challenges to face, and Ginny was ready. She had taken control, and nothing would ever take it from her again. The room was quiet, the kind of stillness that felt almost sacred. Ginny sat at the head of the long oak table, the papers before her spread out like a map of her future. Her hand hovered over the documents, her fingers tracing the edges with the same care she had given the vineyard for so many years. This moment was the culmination of everything. The years of quiet resistance, the sacrifices, the decisions that had led her here. Her eyes flicked to Rose, who stood beside her with a quiet, knowing look. Rose had seen this day coming, had been with Ginny through every turn, every twist of fate. She was a constant, a loyal friend who had never wavered. Beside Rose was Lila, her granddaughter, standing tall but with a softness to her, as if she, too, could feel the weight of this moment. The three of them, Ginny's foundation, were all here, witnessing the final act of independence, the moment when Ginny would take control once and for all. Ginny picked up the pen, her fingers steady as she signed her name, the strokes deliberate, unhurried. The action was simple, but the significance was immense. With each flourish of ink, she was severing ties, removing Micah and Trina from the inheritance, from the life she had worked so hard to build. They would never have control of the vineyard. It was no longer their legacy to claim. The silence in the room stretched long as Ginny moved through the pages, signing each one, the finality of it settling around them like a heavy fog. Rose, who had witnessed it all, nodded approvingly, her eyes full of pride. Lila stood motionless, her gaze never leaving her grandmother, understanding the gravity of the decision more than anyone. She knew this wasn't just about the estate. This was Ginny's life, her choices, her legacy, now and forever. When the last page was signed, Ginny set the pen down with a soft click. There was no fanfare, no celebration, only the quiet sense of liberation that filled the room. This was a decision made not in anger, but in clarity. The vineyard was hers, and it always would be. But now it was being passed to the one person who would carry it forward with respect, with devotion: Lila. Ginny slid the papers over to Eric Lawson's folder, handing them off with a sense of finality. Rose moved to her side, giving her a gentle touch on the shoulder, her expression one of quiet pride. Lila stepped forward, her eyes locking with Ginny's. The legacy was now hers to carry. The future was already unfolding. "I'll file these immediately," Eric said, his voice steady, confident. Ginny gave a small nod, her mind already turning toward the next step, the next phase of her life. The moment was not about Micah or Trina anymore. It was about Lila, about ensuring the future of the vineyard, and with it, the future of everything Ginny had worked so hard to protect. As Eric left the room to take the papers for filing, Ginny stayed seated, her fingers pressing lightly on the desk. The decision had been made, the path set in motion. She looked over the signed documents one last time, her heart steady, but a smile tugging at the corners of her lips. This was peace. This was control. And she felt a wave of satisfaction sweep over her. But as Ginny gathered her things to leave, she noticed the small notification on her phone. Trina had posted a family photo on social media, one of those perfect staged images that held none of the truth. A picture of harmony, of unity, of something that never existed. Ginny smiled softly, an almost imperceptible glint of amusement in her eyes. Trina, so utterly unaware of the change that had just occurred. She still thought the game was hers to win, still believed in the false narrative she had carefully constructed. Ginny knew better. In a few days, the truth would emerge. The will would be read, the inheritance would be settled, and the look on Trina's face when she realized what Ginny had done would be more satisfying than anything money could buy. Ginny glanced up at Rose and Lila, who stood together, silent but understanding. The future, as it always had been, was in their hands now. The vineyard, the estate, and the legacy of the Montgomery family would live on, and it would be preserved, nurtured, and protected by the only people who had ever truly respected it. Ginny's decision was final. She had taken control. And nothing, not even Trina's ignorance, could undo what she had done. The house was quiet again, the kind of silence that came with the finality of a decision made. Ginny sat by the large window in her study, her gaze drifting over the vineyard that stretched out before her, like a living testament to everything she had worked for. The vines were bare for winter, the rows neat and tidy in the fading light. But Ginny knew they would bloom again. They always did. And so would the legacy she had cultivated with such care, now safely passed on to the only person who truly understood it, Lila. Ginny's fingers rested lightly on the edge of the desk where the final documents now sat, certified by the probate court. The weight of them, as light as they were in her hands, carried an immense sense of closure. Micah and Trina had no more claim to the vineyard, to the estate, or to any part of her legacy. Her decision was now official, irrevocable. A small smile tugged at the corners of Ginny's lips as she glanced at the framed photograph of Thomas, her late husband. He had been her partner in everything, in the dream, in the building of the vineyard, in the sweat and sacrifice. He had always believed in their legacy, and though he was gone, Ginny had carried it forward. Now, it would live on through Lila. Ginny's thoughts wandered to the years that had passed, the way Micah and Trina had slowly shifted from children she had raised with love into people who believed they were entitled to everything she had built. The years of undermining, the subtle jabs, the constant pressure to sell, to downsize, to relinquish control, it had all led to this. The decision had been hard, but it was right. Lila, who had always respected the land and understood the sacrifice that had gone into it, was the only one worthy of carrying the torch forward. Ginny had made sure of it. She thought back to the quiet moments when she had reflected on her choices, the moments of doubt that had crept in. Was it too harsh? Was she being unfair? But the more she thought about it, the surer she became. This was her legacy, and she had done everything necessary to protect it. For herself, for the vineyard, and for Lila. Ginny stood up, moving across the room toward the window. Her heart swelled with pride as she watched Lila outside, inspecting the vines, already walking in the footsteps of those who had come before her. Ginny could see it in her posture, the quiet confidence, the respect for the land. It was as if the vineyard had already begun to feel the weight of Lila's presence. The mantle had been passed, and Ginny felt a surge of peace flood over her. The shadow of Micah and Trina no longer loomed over her. It no longer hovered like a storm waiting to break. Ginny knew that the future of the vineyard was secure, and she felt no doubt in her heart. Lila would protect it. She would nurture it with the same care that Ginny had. The work was done. As Ginny walked outside to join her granddaughter, the cold air hit her skin, but it was refreshing, invigorating. Lila looked up and smiled when she saw her, the connection between them palpable, unspoken. Ginny felt an overwhelming sense of pride watching Lila standing tall, taking ownership of the land in ways Micah and Trina never had, never would. "You're ready," Ginny said quietly, her voice filled with the pride she had been carrying for years. Lila nodded, her eyes reflecting the weight of what lay ahead, but also the excitement. "I'm ready," she replied, her voice steady, filled with the certainty of someone who knew exactly what was at stake. They stood there for a moment, watching the vineyard stretch out before them, knowing this was the future. Ginny's legacy was in good hands, hands that would honor it, protect it, and carry it into a future that was bright, secure, and full of promise. The once fragile feeling of doubt was gone, replaced by the strength of knowing that Lila, her granddaughter, would continue what they had built. Ginny walked toward the rows of vines, her hand brushing against the cold, gnarled bark of one of the vines, now dormant for the winter. The vineyard had weathered storms, had grown through the darkest of seasons, and it would grow again, just as she would. She looked at Lila again, who was still gazing across the vineyard, her shoulders relaxed but her eyes sharp with determination. Ginny felt a deep sense of relief, of pride, of peace. This was her decision, her future, and it was now entirely in Lila's hands. The battle had been long, it had taken everything Ginny had, but it had been worth it. And now, she could breathe easy, knowing the vineyard would be safe. As they turned to head back to the house, Ginny's gaze lingered on the rows of vines, and a soft, almost imperceptible smile tugged at her lips. Her legacy was secure, and the future was safe. For the first time in years, Ginny felt truly free, and that freedom, that control, was hers to keep. The sun dipped low in the sky, casting a warm, golden glow across the vineyard. The fields were bathed in the soft light of late afternoon, the vines stretching out in neat rows, their bare branches now awaiting the first hints of spring. Ginny sat on the porch of the house, the same porch where she had spent so many hours over the years, watching the seasons change, watching the land breathe with life. The gentle clinking of her wine glass, the only sound, filled the air as she took another sip, savoring the richness of the estate's own wine. It tasted of everything she had built, everything she had fought for. The earth, the sweat, the blood, and the endless hours spent nurturing this land into something beautiful. The vineyard was more than just rows of grapes and vines. It was a part of her, a reflection of her resilience, her strength. She had shaped it with her hands, with her heart. And now, as the evening sky began to turn from gold to violet, Ginny felt an overwhelming sense of peace. The vineyard was finally where it belonged, in the right hands, Lila's hands. For so long, Ginny had been trapped in a cycle of uncertainty, of doubt, of being undermined by those she had once trusted. But now, as the estate stretched out before her, she felt only pride. Pride in her decisions, pride in her choices. The vineyard would live on, flourishing, and it would do so in the care of someone who truly understood it. Lila would honor the land, carry the legacy forward with the same love and respect Ginny had poured into it. Ginny set her glass down on the arm of the porch swing, her fingers lingering on the cool glass for just a moment before resting at her side. The weight of everything she had done, everything she had been through, felt lighter now. She no longer needed to prove anything to anyone. She had built this, her life, her legacy, and she had secured its future. There was nothing left to fear, nothing left to regret. She watched the last rays of the sun sink below the horizon, the sky a deep, bruised purple. It was a beautiful, calm evening, the kind Ginny had always cherished. She leaned back in her chair, closing her eyes for just a moment, letting the wind brush across her face, letting the sounds of the world settle into her bones. She had created something that would endure. The vineyard was alive, not just in the rows of vines, but in the legacy she had left behind. Her thoughts shifted to Leela. The girl had always understood the value of hard work, the importance of legacy. Ginny had watched her grow from a quiet child into a strong, capable young woman, someone who would never take what she had for granted. It was clear now, Lila was ready to carry the torch forward. Ginny had prepared her for this, prepared her for the weight of the vineyard. She had done everything she could to ensure its future was safe. Ginny's reverie was interrupted by the sound of footsteps approaching. She looked up and smiled as Lila stepped onto the porch, her presence as calm and steady as ever. There was an understanding between them, an unspoken connection that went beyond words. Lila had been the one constant, the one person Ginny could trust. And now, it was her turn. Lila joined her on the swing, sitting beside her without a word, just as the two of them often did. They sat in silence for a few moments, both of them looking out at the vineyard, the peaceful stillness of the evening surrounding them. "Grandma," Lila said quietly, her voice soft but filled with emotion. "I can't even begin to tell you how much this means. You've done so much for this place. For me. I won't let you down." Ginny smiled, turning her head slightly to look at her granddaughter. Her eyes were warm with love, but there was no doubt in her heart. "I know you won't, sweetheart," she said, her voice steady, full of pride. "You've always understood. The vineyard is in good hands, your hands." Lila looked down at the vines, her fingers grazing the worn wood of the swing. "I'll take care of it, Grandma. I'll make sure it's everything you've always dreamed of." Ginny's heart swelled with pride. The fight had been long, but now, as she sat beside Lila, watching the future unfold before them, she knew it had been worth it. The battles she'd fought, with her children, with herself, had all led her here, to this moment, to this peace. For the first time in years, Ginny felt the weight of everything she had built, and it felt right, secure. She had shaped her future, and now, the vineyard's future was in the hands of someone worthy. The legacy was safe. Ginny let out a quiet sigh, her eyes lingering on the horizon as the last of the sunlight disappeared. "This will be remembered," she thought. "My story, my legacy. It will be remembered. On my terms." Lila squeezed her grandmother's hand, a simple gesture, but one that spoke volumes. The two of them sat there together in the quiet of the evening, knowing that the vineyard, the heart of Ginny's life's work, was secure. Ginny picked up her glass again, her gaze steady and unshaken, and she raised it toward the future, toward Lila, toward everything she had built. "They gave me a plastic cup at dinner," Ginny murmured, a soft smile crossing her lips. "So I served the wine from my estate instead." And with that, Ginny Montgomery knew her legacy would live on, as strong as ever, and no one could take it from her.